stories for bedtime
and car time and playtime.
And anytime you want to hear how much Jesus loves you in all this world.
Even little birds.
Hi, I'm Pastor Sarah at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, Iowa. Welcome to this podcast where we tell stories told just for kids and kids at heart. Every week we tell a story about Jesus from the Bible, and for this podcast, you need to bring your imaginations. We're going to imagine that there was a little bird in all of those Bible stories, a little bird who was friends with Jesus, a little bird who saw all the stuff that Jesus did and heard all the things that Jesus said. Well, friends, today's story will be a little different than our other stories. Today, we're going to need a little more imagination than most weeks. The Bible tells us that after Jesus' resurrection, the disciples walked back to Galilee and waited for Jesus to give them the Holy Spirit and instructions about what to do next. But we don't know what they did during that time of walking and waiting. They didn't have phones or TVs or video games or even books. So they had to tell stories, a lot of stories. So this week, we're going to imagine what the disciples were talking about. And while the setting is imagined, the stories, called parables, are stories that Jesus really told. And the only way that those stories survived all these many hundreds of years since Jesus lived was for people to remember them and share them and tell them again. And that's what we'll do today in episode 22.
Little Bird and Jesus remember their favorite sayings.
So, it was at least a week after that very first Easter. Mary Magdalene had already met Jesus in the garden. Cleopas and his wife Mary walked and talked with the stranger, who was actually Jesus. Thomas had touched Jesus' hands and sides. They were no longer quite so afraid, and so the disciples decided to leave that big city of Jerusalem. Little Bird was glad about this. She didn't like that big city. She was happy to be flying along the road, looking down at Jesus' friends as they walked with new joy and new purpose down the road to Galilee, where Jesus promised to meet them. It was a long walk. And so to pass the time, they did what they always did, by talking and telling stories. Martha was walking with her brother Lazarus. Do you remember Martha and Lazarus? Lazarus was Jesus' friend who had died. Jesus cried and was so sad about it. But then Jesus brought him back to life. Well, Martha said to her brother, "Remember how Jesus used to tell us those funny stories that seemed so strange? He called them parables. I loved those stories. Which one was your favorite, Lazarus?" Lazarus replied, "I love the one about the woman and her lost coin." Martha said, "Oh, yes, that's a good one. Will you tell it to me now to pass the time while we walk?" Lazarus thought for a while. He wanted to make sure he had all the details right. And as he did, Little Bird flew down close so she could hear him. He said, "Jesus told the story about a woman who had 10 silver coins." Among the things that Little Bird could never understand was how much people cared about those little round metal things they called coins. But she knew it was how they got food and clothes and everything they need. And she knew that a silver coin was very valuable. Each one of those coins could buy a whole lot of stuff. Lazarus kept telling the parable. The coins were very precious to the woman, and every day the woman would count them, until one day the woman was counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What? That's all she had. She only had 9 of her coins. One of them was missing. So the woman started to look in all the obvious places for her missing coin. But it wasn't on the floor or in her pockets or on the table. She lit a lamp and looked on the shelves and in the cupboards, but she still couldn't find it. So the woman found a broom and swept in every corner and under every piece of furniture. Still no coin. But she couldn't and she wouldn't give up. She kept on looking and looking, turning her house upside down, trying to find that lost coin, until she saw something shining in one of the corners. Was that a coin? It was! She found it! And she was so happy that she put the coin back where it belonged with all of the other ones. When that coin had returned to the others, she put down her lamp and her coin and did a dance of joy. And as she danced, she realized she didn't want to celebrate her found coin alone. She went outside and invited everyone she met over for a party. Soon her house was filled with joy and laughter. Someone whispered to another person, "This party is awesome. But what's the occasion? Is it somebody's birthday?" The other person whispered, "No, she just found her lost coin. It was incomplete and missing, and then she found it. And that, I guess, it's worth celebrating." As Lazarus finished the story, he and Martha laughed together, and Martha said, "Jesus sure loved these stories about lost things being found. It reminds me about how much Jesus cared about finding every single person and bringing them back into his love. He wanted to make sure anyone who was lost and alone would be found. He didn't want anyone to be lost and alone, and would never stop trying to show people his love. And Jesus sure loved to celebrate. Even the smallest thing was a reason to have a party. Little Bird's heart was full of joy from that story as she flew above the disciples. Just then, Peter's voice caught her attention. He was talking to his brother, Andrew. You remember Peter and Andrew the fishermen? Well, Peter said to Andrew, "Andrew, do you remember the time Jesus told us that story about the shepherd?" Andrew said, "Peter, Jesus talked about shepherds and sheep all the time. He liked sheep so much, his favorite fruit was a banana." Peter laughed. "It's true. Remember that prayer he taught us? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Andrew responded, "That's a good one, Peter. I've never heard that one before. Get it? Like a sheep is in a herd?" Peter corrected Andrew. "Sheep are not in herds, but flocks, Andrew. But when all the girl sheep get together, it's a reunion. Get it? Because girl sheep are called ewes." Little Bird loved all these jokes, but she was groaning. They were really bad. She hoped they'd stop this ridiculous joking because she really wanted to hear that story about the shepherd. So Peter said, "All of this is very clever, but I think Little Bird up there is tired of all of our jokes." Little Bird chirped in response. No truer words had ever been spoken. Peter went on, "So, Jesus told that story about how there was once a shepherd with 100 sheep. He loved them, every single one of them, and he counted them every day. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He knew every one of their unique baa's and their fluffy wool, or the black spots they had, or the ones with funny ears. The shepherd knew and loved his sheep. But one day he was counting his sheep, as he did every day. And as he got to the end, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99. Oh no! One of the sheep was missing. The shepherd was so worried about that sheep. So right away, he went to try to find it. He walked to all the usual hiding spots and all the dangerous streams, the shady bushes and the spots with soft grass. He looked left and right and north and south, east and west, everywhere. And then, after he had looked for so long, the shepherd heard something. A bleating sound. It was his beloved little sheep. There she was, caught in a thorny bush. The shepherd carefully pulled her from the bush and held her close. She was safe and found. He carried her gently back to the rest of the flock, or herd of sheep. And when the sheep was back with all of its other sheep friends, the shepherd did a little dance to celebrate her being found. He was so happy he wanted to share the joy, so he invited everybody he knew to a party. And soon that field was full of joy and laughter, along with all the baas of joy from the sheep. Someone whispered to another person, "This party is awesome, but what's the occasion? Is it someone's birthday?" The other person whispered, "No, the shepherd found his lost sheep. It was lost, and then he found it, and now his flock is back together again, complete. And that's worth celebrating." When Peter finished telling Jesus' story, Andrew laughed and said, "Oh, Jesus loved those stories about lost things being found. And that's just what he did. He found all of us, knows all of his people, just like that shepherd knows and loves his sheep." Hearing that story, both of those stories, made Little Bird remember all the times that Jesus made sure that she was safe and cared for. She was just a little sparrow after all. But Jesus made sure that she was never lost or abandoned. She was always cared for. Little Bird knew each of those disciples, and everyone who met Jesus felt the same way, that they knew that they belonged and that they mattered and that they counted. Hi, podcast friends. Those were fun stories about lost things being found, weren't they? These are fun stories to pretend about. Maybe you can take a coin and hide it somewhere for a sibling or a parent to find. And when you find it, throw a little dance party. Or hide a bunch of stuffed animals. And when you find them, pile them up in one big happy pile. And every one of those can be found and celebrated. Or just play hide and seek. It is pretty scary to feel lost or alone. So one of the things we can do in our lives is to keep our eyes and our hearts open to other people who might be alone or might feel like they don't belong. We can be like that shepherd and try to help people feel less lost. Maybe someone at your school or at the playground doesn't have anyone to play with, or they are left out of a game. You can be someone who invites them to play, or plays with them, or helps them feel welcome. When you do this, you'll be like Jesus, and you'll spread some love in this world. And when you feel alone, know that Jesus is always with you, and that you will always matter so much to him. Well, that's it for this episode of Little Bird and Jesus.
Now flap your little wings. Sing a little song.
And remember that to Jesus,
You will always belong.
Thanks for listening to Little Bird and Jesus, a podcast of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Davenport, Iowa. For more information on St. Paul, visit us at stpaulqc.org. Come visit us again next week as Little Bird continues her journey.